For a lot of people, the sex abuse crisis in the church is a deal breaker when it comes to their Catholicism. And for me, it certainly was one of the things that many people have asked me a lot about. How could you join a church that allows priests to abuse little kids and then covers it up? I want to talk with you today about how I began to process that, because of course the sex abuse crisis is a horrible evil and something that, horrifies all of us, really, because how could this thing go on? How could it last for so long and be so widespread? And how could you possibly want to be a Catholic, right? Well, let me tell you how I began to process this. The first thing I had to do is think about the objection itself. And for people that throw this objection at me, I always feel like there's an ulterior motive going on with it. It's not that they're not horrified by the abuse, but when someone brings this up as an objection, I often think to myself, if it weren't for the sex abuse crisis, would you become a Catholic? If the answer to that question is no, then really what's the point of the objection? Because the whole idea of the sex abuse crisis has nothing to do with what the Catholic Church teaches or professes. It's about human behavior. It's about human sin. There's nothing inherent to Catholic Church teaching that contributes to the sex abuse crisis. In fact, it's the denial and the refusal to obey the Church's teaching that leads to abuse and sin and all of this whole mess that we're in. But when people level that objection at us, it's almost done so in a way that's to say, well, yes, Catholicism must lead to abuse, which is just plain ridiculous, because if that were the case, then any subculture of humanity that has sex abuse present within it would be invalidated, which the fact is, that's all of them. I was reading an article today in Psychology Today magazine, and it was talking about the crisis in the church and myths that were associated with it. And one of the myths associated with the church abuse crisis is that there's somehow this greater proportion of Catholic priests that are abusers than other groups of men. And what it showed was that that's a myth. That the reality is that 4% of Catholic priests have had credible accusations leveled against them, whereas public school teachers, for example, have had 6% of credible abuse allegations leveled against them. And the more you read the article and the more that you actually look at statistics, you see that when it comes to the numbers, Catholic churches and Catholic priests have about the same amount of abuse reported in them as everybody else. So it's not a decidedly Catholic issue. So why is it always leveled at Catholicism? I think that there's just this deep-seated hatred leveled at Catholics that maybe isn't as prevalent in other places. So that's why I asked that question. Well, if it weren't for that issue, would you become a Catholic? So let's look at the idea, though, of whether or not the existence of abuse and crisis in an organization like the Catholic Church should invalidate it when it comes to its claims about truth and whether or not it should be followed. If that were the case, then all of us as Christians are in big trouble, because the crisis in the church that we're experiencing right now, the sex abuse crisis, certainly is not the first time in history that there's been some sort of problem with the followers of God not behaving themselves correctly. It goes all the way back to the beginning. It goes back to even before the beginning. If you look at what happened in heaven, for example, we all believe that Lucifer was this mighty angel and rebelled against God and took with him a third of the angels, which are now his demons. This is pretty much a universally taught tradition, by the way, in Christianity. Well, if that was a problem, that there was a crisis in heaven, then what should all of the angels have done who stayed behind? Should they have said, well, we can't remain here in heaven because there was a crisis, there was rebellion? Think about the children of Israel. Now, there were a lot of bad leaders that the children of Israel were led by, weren't there? Lots of sin, lots of idolatry, lots of bad stuff took place with those people who led Israel. Should the children of Israel have said, well, we can't stay here. We need to go off and form a new nation where everybody is righteous and pure 100% of the time? Of course not. they stayed, and God worked through that and worked in that and did what he had to do. Let's talk about the apostles. We know Peter denied Jesus. We know Judas betrayed Jesus. Should the other 10 apostles have said, well, we can't stay here with these guys anymore. We need to go off and start our own churches? Obviously not, because what we have to remember is the behavior of people who follow a particular teaching. Their behavior or their lack of behavior, the refusal to obey the teaching, doesn't invalidate the teaching of the organization. So the fact that people can't live up to what God calls us to do doesn't invalidate who God is or what God is doing in our lives. I mean, think about this. Anybody could look at your life or my life and invalidate what we do if they knew enough about us. If our own behavior were the focus, we'd all be in some serious trouble. Now, we don't all become abusers, but we all wrestle with sin. So how did I process all this? How do you process it? I'll tell you, for me, I tend to not spend a lot of time focusing on other people and their behavior, especially when it's bad, because it can get really discouraging and frustrating. One of the things I love about the Mass is when we say the penitential rite. And when that happens, I'm not thinking about confessing other people's sins. I'm thinking about my own. And I think that's a good place for all of us to start. We need to be focused on our own behavior, our own call to holiness, and the ways that we're not measuring up to what God's called us to do. So I think for me, that is the first thing that is always at the forefront of my mind. It's not what other people are doing or not doing. It's looking at myself and going, where am I falling short? Where do I need to up my game in terms of holiness? I know that it's difficult. Abuse is evil. And I really do believe that there is a measure of judgment that's going to be dished out to those men who have been charged with leading and protecting the flock of God that have instead abused and used people for their own pleasure and their own sinful gain. There's a measure of judgment coming for those guys that, man, I think should strike fear into the hearts of all of us, really. But when I think about those who are faithful to their charge, my heart goes out to these guys. I know that for them, every day when they wake up in the morning and they put on their collar and they walk into society, they're being judged. They're being mistreated and viewed with mistrust just for being a Catholic priest. And I think about that. That's an unintended consequence of this whole issue. I think about the victims of this abuse crisis, and I think, man, what do we need to do to help take care of them, to help them heal, to come alongside those who have been through this unspeakable evil? What if we all just leave? Then who's going to be left? The answer is to focus on Jesus and to do the best that we can to live holy lives and to do the best that we can to take care of those who have been abused and those who are faithful to their charge also. If we do that, I believe there's great hope in store for the church and for what God is going to do in all this. I do have hope as a Catholic. I think that what the church is doing and has done in recent years to root out this evil, I think it's substantial. And I think people need to take a hard look at that and acknowledge what the church is doing. For example, I can go online right now and find a list of all priests in my diocese that have been credibly accused of sex abuse going back, decades. Where does that come from? These lists are compiled with information provided by our own diocese. The church puts this information out there in a way to root out this evil. Can you think of another denomination that does that? Now, maybe there's a list out there somewhere publicly where all of the accused Baptists or Presbyterians are cataloged. I don't know. I haven't seen it. But you certainly can't say that the church isn't doing anything about it. I think the church is doing a lot. Now, is it doing everything perfectly? I'm sure it isn't. Are there still areas where the church needs to reform and grow and work through this? Absolutely. But I believe the promise that Jesus gave to the church, that not even the gates of hell shall stand against it. And that was one of the truths that brought me into the Catholic faith. And I wasn't about to let the sins of other people stand in my way when I was discovering the truth of Catholicism. And I pray that for you, you don't let the sins of other people stand in your way either when you think about the truth of God's holy church. When you think about the sacraments that are being offered to you in Mass, don't let some sinful priest or some sinful bishop or whatever else stand in your way. Jesus has made a way for you to holiness. And he's made a way, he's made a church for you to participate in. And the church is filled with flawed, sinful human beings, just like you and just like me. And far worse. But that doesn't invalidate the truth of the church. God has not abandoned his church. And I shouldn't either. And neither should you. So stay faithful to God's command. Stay faithful to his teaching. Stay faithful to the sacraments. Stay faithful to the church. Stay faithful to Jesus. He's promised to get us through this, and he will. And I don't want to be on the outside looking in when he does. I want to be right there with him in his church. Thanks for watching this video. I hope that it made sense to you. This is how I process this, and I hope that it's helped you understand. God bless you.